born and raised in Nina, in Tipperary. Unfortunately, my father was, and as far as I'm aware, still is to this day, a very violent and nasty individual, but also suffered with alcoholism, which he still is, an alcoholic, and also a chronic gambler. We moved from Ireland to London when I was around about 2 or 3 years old. I don't think we were particularly brought up in the right environment. It was a very chaotic and very dangerous place to live. I would witness domestic violence and abuse all the time, pretty much every day. I'd witness my father beat my mum half to death most of the time. And that's very difficult to witness and, I guess, accept, because it's so difficult to accept that your father's like that and treats your mum, the woman that he's meant to love and care for. The same as, she's also my mum, not just his partner, but it's very difficult to see that and kind of accept it. And knowing that you can't do anything about it, I think that's the hardest thing to accept. And unfortunately for my life, it was very difficult growing up. And also when you're a very young child, who do you tell? Do you go to school and tell your teachers what you see at home, knowing that, when I lived at home, it was always fear. We were always terrified of what state my father would come in the house. Hopefully he'd be that drunk that he would just sort of pass out on the sofa or go to bed and pass out. And, maybe he had a good day at the bookies as well, so he might have been in a better mood. But ultimately, as probably most gamblers and alcoholics will tell you, or any form of drug addict, it never really is a good day, no matter how much of the drug that you take, how much you consume. And also, when you fear for your life, and you see some of the stuff that your father's done to your mum, you're scared to tell anybody. My father tried to kill me as a child as well. The first time he ever tried to intervene, when he was beating my mum up, he beat me up and he covered me in terps, which is turpentine, and tried to set me on fire. Now, I think I was about 7 or 8 years old when that happened. If you know that your father's prepared to kill you, you're terrified to tell anybody. For me, growing up as positive as I always tried to be, fundamentally I was a mess inside. I was about 17. I was actually at college, and I got introduced to cocaine, which was the first drug that I took. And I loved it. I don't want to glamorize it or, promote it in any way, shape or form. But I think for me, when you have this underlying issue of, I constantly felt worthless and not good enough. And I always blame myself for my father's behaviors, not my father. I used to think that I wasn't good enough. I deserved what I went through. Maybe if I was better at everything, or, maybe he might have loved me, and I fundamentally, I felt like I wasn't good enough to be loved. And that, unfortunately, has traveled and kept with me throughout my entire life. I had quite a few good years of, well, I say good years, I don't mean good years, but I took cocaine for, probably 3 or 4 years consistently. So it became a Wednesday thing, as well as a Friday and Saturday, and then a Sunday, and then a Thursday, and then a Monday and Tuesday. And then it just became, a constant all the time. I was using cocaine from the moment I woke up to the moment I passed out. But I was also highly functional. I was a functional addict. So I could hold down a job, I could get up and go to work, I could do most things. I knew it was a problem pretty quickly. I mean, at the time I'd lost the job. I'd been partying all weekend, and I went to work, and I did a line of coke in the toilet to try and bring me around, because I'd been awake for 3 days at this point, I think. And I actually collapsed at my desk. I sat down and I collapsed. The guy that owned the company that I worked for used to also be an ex-police officer, so he wasn't that easy to convince that I wasn't, nearly overdosed or whatever it was. But I got fired from that job, and I didn't look at me. I didn't reflect and go, "Oh God, this is my problem." I was like, "Oh God, he's an arsehole. He should never have fired me. I've earned more money than anybody else," and blah blah blah. I always looked at everybody else like they were the problem. I moved back to London sort of when I was about 18 and 18, 19. And I guess I was still an addict, but I would only use mostly at weekends, but I would definitely use all weekend. So it was a bit more manageable. But then I went back to Barnsley, and I used to go back every so often. And the people that I knew started taking ketamine. I think predominantly because it was cheaper, or so initially I thought. And I never really felt that it affected me. Like me and my friend went to a house to do something, and They gave us some ket, and it sounds really bad this, but we got back in the car, and also the guy that was driving had also took CK, and we drove back into town to go out, and we were like looking at each other going, I can't feel any, I don't, that didn't work. It was, he hasn't given us ketamine. It was, God knows what it was, flour or whatever. And yeah, so then we thought we'll try it. But a lot of the people that I hung around with then, they would use ketamine on nights out, but also they would have like film parties and stuff like that. So we'd all go to a house and we'd just take ketamine and we'd watch a film. And you could watch the same film 100 times on ketamine and it wasn't the same film. And like I'd wake up or come round and I'd be like, oh my God, I'd watch a World War II film and I'd be like, I've just been fighting in Germany, or like I killed Hitler. Like it was and it was really, you know, it's a dissociative drug, and it just completely, it takes you have no concept of reality whatsoever. And I think that's what I really liked about ketamine, was the fact that I could take it. All the voices that I used to argue with in my head would instantly shut up, or for a period of time anyway. And I just forgot about everything. You know, I didn't care. It gives you like a full sense of security where everything in the world is fine. Until you come back round and then you need more to, you know, and that's when it becomes a vicious cycle. But then a lot of stuff changed in my life. I got, you know, I was introduced to more and more dodgy people. And at the time I think I'd lost a job, and, you know, the guy who used to buy ketamine off was like, you're buying quite a lot, you might as well just buy it and sell it as well. Which to someone that takes ketamine, you know, it's a great job. You know, I can have all this money and free ketamine and that sounds good. So that's what I did. And my life became more and more complex and complicated. What happened was I got really ill, like physically, because ketamine destroys like your bladder, can, you know, affect your kidneys also, you know, your mental health, obviously, especially, it takes a huge toll with any drug. But ketamine has really severe implications inside as well. So I moved back to Ireland for a couple of years. I say I stopped taking drugs. I didn't. I think I used drugs maybe 3 or 4 times, but for a 2-year period, that, you know, that's amazing. And I came back to England, moved back to Barnsley. I worked in the education sector, which probably isn't the best place for a drug addict to work. Even though I was incredibly good at my job and I didn't directly work with children, I was a business development executive. So I was, you know, I managed thousands of schools across the country, and that was my job. But I wouldn't do drugs at work, but I would do drugs pretty much every evening and weekend. And what I realised was I got drug tested quite a lot because of my criminal record, but the drug tests that they tested me only tested for like cocaine, ecstasy, cannabis, which I can't stand either, and alcohol. And they were drugs that I'd stopped doing. So instantly that told me, or my silly brain was like, so ketamine is the drug that you should take from now on, like permanently, because you'll never get caught at work. And obviously at the time it was like, ketamine's good for me. It helps with my depression and all this crap. I was easily snorting somewhere in the region of, I don't know, maybe a Henry, just 3.5 grams to a quart, maybe a day. So between 3.5 to 7 grams a day. The weekends I could easily, you know, go through an ounce at that point. But then in 2018, I was made redundant from my career, which I absolutely loved as well, by the way. I had, despite the addiction, you know, I had an amazing career and I learned so much through that. I think being made redundant completely reinstilled the idea of, you know, you're useless. Even your employers don't love you, or you're not accepted. And it just brought up all this childhood, you know, all my childhood stuff that I had going on that I'd never resolved either. And in my worst days, you know, I could easily snort an ounce a day, not a problem. I was involved in dealing it back then, so it didn't cost me a lot. An ounce would, back then, but when I was doing it, was probably about 250 quid. Which obviously, you know, when I wasn't dealing it or involved in it, that's what I was paying. You know, my mum definitely noticed a change. But then the thing is, you know, people that love and care for you, you isolate yourself from, because you don't want them to see you, A, like that, and B, I think you you know, you feel guilty and ashamed to be around people that love and care for you, because you're used to being in that sort of world where no one gives a shit about you apart from if they're buying drugs or selling drugs. So I guess you sort of lose real friends and real people around you because you focus more on the group where it's socially acceptable to use drugs. You know, it's not if if I got a gram of ketamine or whatever, started racking it up on a table, you'd think, God, this is weird. But I was in an environment where if you wasn't doing that, it was weird. I was in an environment that if you weren't ketty all the time, what was wrong? So I was officially made redundant, I think, in sort of April 2018. And by the time I'd started to lose quite a lot of weight, I found out about my redundancy and I kind of expected the whole thing to happen anyway. It wasn't just me, it was the whole department. But I sort of knew about January time. So at that point, rather than being positive and thinking, I can go and work for a competitor or do whatever, I actually just sort of wallowed in self-pity, which is what ironically most drug addicts do. And I became very depressed, became very suicidal. I had a couple of attempts and stuff. And I guess my lowest point was, just before I went to rehab, I weighed 6 stone, I was homeless. I'd lost literally half my body weight in a matter of months. I was really ill. I used to have ket cramps constantly, which anybody that has taken ketamine will know how awful that is. The pain is excruciating. You can't breathe properly. You have like hyperventilation because your stomach, especially there, like your diaphragm, you can't breathe. It is the worst pain I used to get rushed into A&E all the time. And they instantly thought I'd been stabbed. I'd be screaming, I'd be vomiting, couldn't breathe, and then I'd be put on more drugs, morphine, which was great. I'd be like, oh God, this is amazing. But, I couldn't stand up correctly. I couldn't stand up to pee. I'd have to like sit in the shower and just try. And also when I used to pass urine, it wasn't like a proper pee. Like I would just pass like a few drops and I'd be screaming and squeezing for about an hour to get that. I would literally spend hours, if not most of my time in the toilet, to the point where I used to have to sit on a towel and stuff if I was driving or sitting down because I would piss myself. My bladder was absolutely a mess. I was told by doctors that I would have to have my bladder replaced or removed completely and wear a bag. I was told by doctors that if I didn't stop taking drugs and I didn't kill myself through suicide, that I would probably die through malnourishment. And obviously through my addiction and just the state that I got myself into. I was quite happy to die as well. I wasn't scared to die. And also I actually wasn't scared to die until I had a son because now I don't want to die. But yeah, so, I wasn't scared to die. And I actually thought that if I died, everything would be better. The world would be a better place. My mum would be happier. My brothers would be better off. All the people I'd hurt and damaged throughout my addiction, maybe there might be a sense of forgiveness and an ease of, pain for them as well. And ultimately I felt that, I would, if you're dead, you don't feel anything anymore. And it's that simple. I actually wanted to die. So that was, definitely my lowest point.
Hi, and welcome to Deep.
We love making videos, meeting people and letting them tell their stories.
We really hope you're enjoying the channel, and if you are and would like a bit more,
We've just launched the series as a podcast on Spotify.
It's the full interviews uncut, so you can hear the whole thing, wherever you are, at home or on the go.
But no matter where you're watching the content, please remember to like, comment and subscribe, as it really helps the channel.
And don't forget to drop a comment below and tell us who you'd like us to talk to next.
Thank you. Now, back to our story.
Okay, cool.
My mum said we were arguing and I was off my head, and at this point I was incredibly thin and frail, and she said, I never raised you to be a junkie. I'm sure no one ever raises their kids to be drug addicts, right? But you raised me in the perfect environment. Look at what I went through. Look at what you went through. That's not normal. I was really angry after that argument. So I climbed back upstairs. I could hardly walk or stand up straight at this point. Racked up more lines of ketamine. And I thought, right, I'm actually going to prove everyone wrong. And more importantly, myself. And I gave myself two choices, which was either I take my life that year, which would have been between Christmas and New Year. And then the second option, which was I sort it out. And I really sort it out. I don't run away back to London, or I don't run away back to Ireland or Zimbabwe or the moon, wherever, Mars. I really tackle it head on. And I knew that I had issues that I needed to resolve. Some of the stuff that I've shared with you today, I never shared until I went to rehab. You know, I was 32 years old when I went to rehab, and I never told a soul about my childhood until then. So thankfully and obviously I chose the latter, which is how I'm still alive. And I tried loads of different things. You know, I tried the 12 steps, I tried therapy, which I also tried when I was a drug addict, and it never really helped. I actually went to the doctors and I had all these issues, you know, mentally and physically. And I cried my eyes out and I said, look, I need help. Like, I am going to kill myself if I don't get help. You know, what do I do? And it was the first time I actually spoke to a health professional. I broke down, I was in tears, I was angry and emotional, and I was like, look, I'm going to die. I need, you know, I don't need more medication. I need help. Like, what the fuck do I do? And to this day, I still don't know if he was taking the piss or not, but he went, Google it. I thought, fuck you, I will Google it. So I went out into my car, snorted more ketamine, cried my eyes out, and I Googled it. And I looked for loads of like recovery services, and thankfully I found a recovery service called Recovery Steps in Barnsley. I went and I spoke to someone. It was the first time I actually spoke to someone I felt listened to, and I actually felt like they get it. And not just because whether they or not they have lived experience as well, but it was the first time that someone sat down and I guess showed me any compassion and empathy. And I would turn up, you know, under the influence of ketamine. I would try not to use an hour before I had to attend, so I could sort of function in some way, shape or form. And I took it really seriously, which sounds crazy when you say I was still using drugs, that I took it seriously. And they saw something in me, some potential to change. I got fast-tracked, and I was lucky enough to receive some funding to get into rehab. And I don't know if you've ever seen The X Factor, but getting into rehab is like The X Factor. So I had to go for an audition, which is kind of like this. I was sat in front of a board, and I had to share my story, you know, tell him what I would do if I went to rehab and why I need it. And I was really honest. I remember the first meeting, I said, look, if I don't get into rehab, I'll kill myself. And that's not a threat. I'm not trying to emotionally blackmail anybody, but like, this is serious. Like, I'm at the point now is if I don't get into rehab, like, I'll kill myself. And it's that simple. And that's if I don't die from the state that I was in. At the end, he went, right, he says, so you've got a difficult decision to make. And he says, you need to choose what rehab you want to go to. And I was like, what do you mean? So I looked at, I was like, what? And I just looked at him and I literally just fell to the floor crying. And it was the first time that I'd ever really had hope. You know, and going to rehab doesn't mean that you're going to beat your addiction, by the way. But even knowing that I had the funding to get into rehab was like an absolute weight lifted off my shoulders. And it allowed me the room I needed to actually focus on beating my addiction and coming to terms with everything that I'd been through, and also accepting that, you know, I also did a lot of damage during my addiction. You know, not just to myself, but other people around me. And you know, I had to really accept that, you know, I wasn't a good person. It doesn't mean that I was evil or, you know, I was inherently bad, but I made a lot of stupid decisions, and I hurt a lot of people in that process. And but it was hard. You know, I lived in a rehab with 29 other people, and it was all completely, I've never been to prison, but it's, from what I've heard, it's worse than prison because, you know, you're locked up 24 hours a day. You have 24/7 support, which is amazing. But you also have to deal with everything that you've gone through. And as I said, you know, that was the first time I really shared about my childhood and spoke about it. And it was, you know, it was a brave thing to do, but also it's what helps you heal. And I'm not recovered, you know, just because I've been to rehab. I don't think I'll ever truly recover from what I've been through, but, you know, I'll certainly never use drugs or alcohol or anything, you know, a substance again. So, but unfortunately, not everybody has the option or the opportunity or resources to go to rehab. But also rehab, unfortunately, has grim statistics as well, you know, just like any other model of recovery. I was in rehab with, as I said, 29 other people. You know, at least 20 of those people are dead today. And I still hear about people dying all the time. People have this perception if you go to rehab and everyone gives you hugs every day, which also happens as well. But like, someone may, you know, waves a magic wand and you're healed. And that's not, I wish that was true. You know, rehab is tough and it's not easy. But also, it should be like that. It needs to be like that. I realised the day I went to rehab that I would never use drugs again, regardless of whatever. And I'm sure I'll be tested. I have been tested. You know, I've been in touch with people that have openly got drugs out in front of me and stuff, which is stupid. me meeting them in the first place, but also being around that. You know, sometimes I'll get an urge or a temptation to be like, you know, I've had a bad day or whatever, but okay, we'll fix all this. And that's just a stupid thought, but I don't act on it because I'm able to think, all right, so if you did that, what would you lose? Which would be everything. You know, I'd hurt my son, my partner, not physically, but mentally and emotionally. And I'd probably be dead within a matter of months. And I'm like, is it really worth it? You know, is it? It's not. So, and I'm abstinent. I don't follow a 12-step program. I'm actually quite against that whole thing. I don't believe addiction is a disease. It's a very complex and multifaceted issue. A societal issue. But yeah, I know what works for me, and that's pretty simple. And, you know, I'm now at university. I've gone back to uni, I've gone back. I never went to uni. And it was always something that I always had ambitions of doing. And I'm the first family member to go to university. Some of them take the piss out of me for it still. But, and I go to quite an elitist institution. I go to the University of Glasgow, which is quite a prestige university. I'm capable of the academic stuff. I'm capable of working in a group. I'm capable of being around normal people and fitting in. And yeah, I guess I do all the stuff that I regretted not doing when I was younger. And I think I make much more of an opportunity of it now, as opposed to if I'd went to uni when I was 18 or whatever, like, you know, the normal route. I've probably used drugs and been kicked out like I was at college, you know, so it wouldn't have changed anything. But thankfully, I managed to turn, I guess, my whole story and journey into a career, which not everyone does. So for me, it's very easy to speak about. Well, it's not necessarily easy, but I have the capacity to speak about it and do things like this, which reminds me of how useless and shit my life was as well, but also how grateful I am for what it is today. There's a lot of people that will go to rehab and go back to the job and never speak about it again, and that may or may not work for them. You know, but for me, I sort of live and breathe it as well, which makes it easier, I think, and harder sometimes. Drugs are so readily available in our society. You know, in Glasgow in particular, it's, you know, as many fast food chain restaurants as there are, it's quicker to order drugs than it is a pizza, and that's an actual fact. We live in a society where rather than dealing with actually what's going on, it's much easier to take a substance to deal with the pain, which is also inherently wrong. Statistically, if you grow up in a poorer area, you're 17 times more likely to become a drug addict. You know, that's just because of where you were born or where you've grown up. That's not your fault. You know, it's a societal problem. I definitely don't believe I was born with some, you know, hereditary set of DNA that determined that I was going to be a drug addict. But I did grow up in the right environment that made me believe that I was worthless and useless. And the only way I could find out, you know, the only way I could find any healing at that point was to use drugs to take me all away from it. You know, I do stuff like this all the time. And if you read some of the comments, it's awful what people say to me. But thankfully, I don't really look at it too much anymore. But I talk about an area that's so demonized and stigmatized because we blame the individual for the addiction. And as I said, it's a multifaceted issue. It's not just the individual's fault. Yes, I chose to take drugs, but also I chose to take drugs because I didn't have any other option. I didn't know I could go to therapy or I could talk to someone about it. I didn't realize that I could talk about I didn't even know what an adverse childhood experiences was, or trauma or suffering. I didn't know what any of those things were. So there's a lack of education around addiction and obviously recovery as well. But yeah, I chose to use drugs, but morally it wasn't the decision that I chose lightly. Sorry, I'm emotional now. But yeah, I never thought I'd be a father. I never wanted to be a father. And not because I was scared of kids or the responsibility, but more I didn't want to fuck their lives up like mine was. And I never decided to have a child to test that theory. It just happened. And and it was the best thing that ever happened to me, other than, sorting my life out. I understand that I have the capacity to fuck his life up. I could ruin his life easily, very easily, without even being a drug addict. I can make the wrong decisions and ruin his life. So I have a great deal of responsibility. But as long as I love him and I cherish him and I allow him to fail, but in a safe, in a safe environment, You know, and I think all any parent wants to do is to raise their children to be loved and cared for. And as long as I do that, you know, I think he'll have a much better opportunity in life than I did. And that doesn't mean that he won't grow up and take drugs either, by the way. You know, I understand that when when he's older, he's nearly 2 now. You know, when he's 16, 17, 18, I dread to think what society is going to be like then. You know, I dread to think of how accessible drugs will be then as well. And also, by that point, drugs might even be legal. You know, will he be in a situation where he is confronted by using drugs? Probably. But hopefully, you know, he'll have had the best life ever, that he understands that he doesn't need to take drugs, and especially not to run away from any pain or suffering. Just believe that you can do it. I had no belief ever at all. I didn't believe that I deserved a good life. I didn't believe that I would be anything other than a drug addict. And I also believe that a lot of people go, oh, yeah, bags of potential and he wasted it, which is ironically what they say about my father. And yeah, you just need to have the belief that you can do it. You know, and if I can go from being a 6-stone addict that wanted to die, that was happily seeking his own death, to now turning his life around, having a beautiful family, yeah, you can. You know, just have the belief that you can do it and have hope. There's millions of people around the world that have beaten their addiction. You know, you can do it. There's nothing that I've done that's special. And I mean that, you know. And there's nothing that I've done that they can't do. So yeah, reach out and speak to someone. Go and ask a doctor and he'll tell you to Google it and all your dreams will come true.